Love matters. Love matters.
Hello, everyone. I am Shashank Bhargav from the Indian Express podcast team. I have with me today my colleague Snigdha Sharma. We also have with us Jennifer Collins, Laura Doing, Sana Rizvi from DW, which is Germany's international broadcaster. And we have with us Bollywood actor, entrepreneur, and now podcast host Evelyn Sharma. We are joined here today to talk about a brand new podcast that Indian Express and DW have collaborated on. It's a podcast about love and relationships called Love Matters with Evelyn Sharma. Evelyn, of course, is the host of this podcast, the trailer for which released a few days ago. And I wanted to kick this off by asking you, Evelyn, what got you interested in this project? What got you interested in becoming a podcast host?
That's a very good question because it's a big jump from what I've been doing earlier. But I think all of our lives have changed over the last 1.5, 2 years. And I think there are always new ways of connecting with the audience. And I feel that I've been maturing with my audience, over the last 10 years. And when DW approached me with this concept for a podcast about love, relationships, especially modern relationships in India, I felt like this is exactly the phase that I am in my life. I'm getting married, I'm becoming a mom. I have my dating life behind me. I have all my friends asking me, how did you meet your husband? And, what's the recipe for a great relationship? And so I thought this is brilliant. This is a wonderful topic for me to learn more, for me to meet interesting people on the podcast, but also for me, cross country, cross continent, to still, in a way, be there, connect to my audience, in a way, still entertain my audience. And I think podcasts are definitely an upcoming medium of connecting to your audience. I feel like it's the radio on demand kind of platform. And I'm really excited to launch this with the Indian Express because I think podcasts are going to become bigger and bigger in India as well. And it's something exciting, so I couldn't say no.
Yeah, and I wanted to tell this to our audience. I mean, we've already mentioned that this is a podcast about love and relationships. And what happens in the show is that each week, you, Evelyn, hear from a listener about a very specific problem that they are going through, and then we have
Yeah.
well-known guests on who open up about their own experiences. And these are
Yes.
very intimate and personal conversations, and people are sharing their experiences. What was it like just being a host and just listening to these kind of personal stories?
I think the best part of a podcast is that you actually, especially right now, recording it from your own comfort zone, from your own living room. And so you're already setting a sort of comfortable environment. And I felt it was a way of having people over to my own living room, having a cup of tea. We were always saying, like, it reminded me of sitting on my balcony in Mumbai and having a cup of chai with a friend, and just having a good conversation on an interesting topic. And the same with this podcast. I think we have these really interesting topics, that really move people. And we have interesting guests. Some of them are my good friends, and some of them I didn't know yet. And so I felt like it's a way of socializing for me, having a great conversation with someone I just met. And on the other hand, catching up with my friends, and just creating a comfortable environment to have a good conversation. And I hope that our listeners will love to kind of peek in on our conversation, but also kind of get involved by telling us what they think on the topic and by writing us more of their questions when it comes to love and relationships and what struggles they're facing. But yeah, we love feedback, and we love to hear, what our audience is going through, and then kind of make that part of our podcast in the next episodes.
Evelyn, I have a question for you. So I wanted to ask you, how different is it working in the audio format as compared to working in front of a camera?
Yeah, it's very different, especially after doing all these acting courses in Mumbai and across the world, and it's all about expressions. It's all about, in Bollywood, I think you have to play more with your eyebrows than in any other film industry. It's all about your facial expressions. It's about how much you move, how much emotion you show through your eyes. And now, being a host on a podcast, it's suddenly all about my voice. And I feel the only experience I had in that is because we do a lot of dubbing for movies. And so sometimes you can enhance your performance, by being in the dubbing studio. But this is not really a performance. So it's not me, acting out a character, but it's just me being myself and having friends over. So it's kind of more like a telephone conversation. And it's a lot more real, and it's a lot more Evelyn, I think. I think also, a lot of my fans especially know me from my accent, and they recognize my voice. So I think it's really fun for them to listen in on a conversation that I'm having with my friends. And I hope that they will enjoy our podcast.
Yeah, well, we are all hoping that. Jennifer, I have a question for you. We've been talking to you since the beginning of this collaboration, and you've really helped, put this together, from scripting to, choosing the guests. And I was just I had a question about, what was the initial idea behind doing this podcast, an Indian podcast about, love and relationships? What was the idea behind this collaboration?
Yeah, and it's just want to say thanks, because it's been great working with you guys as well, and getting your insights and everything like that. So it's been a really nice, intense couple of months, but a lot of fun as well. Yeah, so I mean, first of all, a podcast about love and relationships. Love, relationships are such fundamental, important topics that really, they're so universal to everybody. They touch everybody's lives. Everybody wants to find love, or trying to figure things out with love, or all of that kind of stuff. So we were this is something that we really want to address. And I think as well, in India, where you have this also navigation between this kind of very modern dating and the more traditional ways of meeting somebody, the more traditional ways of meeting somebody, it's just there's a lot to talk about there. There's a lot of interesting scope to have a lot of different kind of conversations and touching on a lot of different issues. So for us, we really wanted a podcast that opened up the space for these conversations, and the more spaces we have to talk about certain things and to normalize certain topics, and the better. And we really wanted to add to that, because love on the one hand is it's fun, it's got everything great attached to it, but it can also it's a very vulnerable space. It's also something where there are topics that can be taboo, and that people don't feel comfortable talking about. And we wanted to help open up the space, as I said, to give people that platform to talk about it, to be vulnerable, to show weakness. And while we were developing the concept that you mentioned, Shashank, where we have a listener call in and tell us a problem, and then guests really open up and be vulnerable. We talked to we did a lot of interviews beforehand to kind of come up with that concept, to hit on that concept. And we spoke to a lot of people in India in kind of focus groups, and it seemed to be something that people really wanted to talk about. They really wanted to have that space to be able to talk about maybe oh, I've just had a kid and I want to go back to work, but I don't know how to do that. Or I have this, I'm thinking about, I'm having problems in my relationship and I want to go to counseling, but I don't know what to do, or I'm having issues with my in-laws and we're living together and I don't know how to do it. So, there seemed to be really an appetite for that. And that's kind of why we ended up hitting on this particular podcast. And I think podcasts themselves are such a great medium for that, because they're so intimate. Like, there's just the person in your ear, as Evelyn said, her voice, the guest's voice, the listener's voice, and it creates the kind of feeling of closeness too.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, there is something about podcasts that feels very intimate, and sometimes I find, myself, when I'm listening to podcasts, sometimes I find myself becoming emotional a lot more than even like books, which also I love. But that kind of connection, that kind of emotions really come through when you're listening to these stories. And Evelyn, like I was wondering, what were some of the most emotional moments for you during the podcast? So, like, was there any point? Was there any conversation? Was there any, anything that a guest shared with you that, really got you emotional?
I think because love is something that we've all experienced in some way or the other. I feel there's this, you feel like you are the other person a lot of times. So I feel for myself, there is something emotional in every episode, because I feel like there's some kind of connect that I have to the story too. Whether it's a previous relationship or it's a current situation. I feel that I really feel the story of the guest or the caller. And we've had several times where people have, felt really vulnerable on the show, but really felt like this is a great opportunity to actually start talking about what they're going through. We've had a little bit of tears on the show as well. I think it's just such a craving that we have for love, for acceptance, for happiness. There's such a deep longing, for just harmony in our life with our family, and that they're on board with our decisions in respect to love, whether we are in love with a person from a different religion, or we're in love with a person of the same sex, and we just want our other loved ones, our support system, to be part of this. And a lot of times there are conflicts, and our callers are in a lot of emotional turmoil. And I think, there's so many intimate moments and so many emotionally touching moments that it's hard to pin on one, but there are several ones in each episode.
And what do you think was the biggest challenge for you, in terms of just being the person that is getting people to open up and having them, share these stories with you?
So because a few of them were also close friends, like Yasmin Karachiwala, or my friends Kathy and Benny Dayal, I think the conversations got vulnerable quite quickly and honest and deep, because they know me and we talk on deeper levels a lot. But when it came to people that I met for the first time, like Kanis Surka, for example, the wonderful comedian who talks a lot about her divorce in a comic sense, I feel like there's a lot of times, we put up a wall around us, we put up a certain image out there of how we deal with our life and how we feel about our life's decisions. And then I think it got really vulnerable at some point. And it's a really good episode to listen into, where Kanis even said, like, I've never really told this to anyone, but we created the safe space. And I think these are challenges, of course, to break down the walls that people have built, and to have a real, honest, raw conversation. But but that's also sort of, I feel where we have to go towards. It's, of course, especially the entertainment industry, showbiz, it's all about walls, it's all about projecting a certain image and building yourself a certain character. But we did not want that on the show. We wanted real, honest people that share their story and, in some way help our listeners to know that they're not alone out there. And we don't really give them a recipe for success in their relationships or how to deal with their problems, because in the end, there's other ways of dealing with really bad and deep problems. I'm always for therapy if it needs to be. But we just try to share our story, our stories, and then I hope it'll inspire people to, become stronger and move forward.
Hi, Laura.
I'm
So,
here.
Laura, I wanted to ask you, first of all, what has it been like, collaborating with the Indian Express? And also, there is a huge culture gap, right, between Germany and India, especially when we're talking about a subject like love and relationships, just the way we approach it. So, how did you handle that?
Sure. Yeah, we try to handle that gap. We try to understand the audience, and we really wanted to dig deeper into the audience needs and feelings. And we asked Indian Express to do a call out for listeners, asking if they are willing to talk to us about their lives, about their relationships, about their emotions, about their needs. And we conducted interviews with a lot of Indian Express listeners. And we did this in the spirit of user-centered format development, meaning that we asked them about their strong emotions. And surprisingly, they were very open and willing to talk openly to us about these topics, and these insights were the backbone for our format. And we learned a lot in these conversations, and that was basically the way we try to deal with this culture gap, which is clearly existing. Sure, yeah.
I have to agree that this is a big culture gap. So I often think of my parents, who were, of course, my father Indian and my mother German, back in the 80s when they met, how they were even, of course, opposites attract, but how they were even able to carry themselves through a relationship and marriage at that time. They were married for about 10 years. But yeah, I am just impressed with people who can, have relationships over such big differences.
I think what we were trying to focus with the podcast is really Indian stories and Indians telling that story. We didn't want to dilute it by saying, we will run the narrative. And I think that has been sort of the push for the podcast from the start, whether it's what Laura said, having these research interviews beforehand. And what I've really found, because I've been involved with research for topics, for listeners, for guests, is that everybody is so open and willing to share. And there seems to be this camaraderie in India where it's like, if my story can help anyone, I'm going to tell it. And I find that if you can latch onto that and be like, wow, there's this sisterhood, brotherhood, whatever you want to call it, Indianness, where everybody's like, I want to share my story because maybe one person will feel better by listening to my story and be like, oh, I'm not alone, so I'm going to share it. And it's been so amazing to have listeners and guests be so open, so vulnerable about things that they don't even tell their family, to absolute strangers. And maybe sometimes it's easier to talk to strangers. And it's been just really heartwarming to have, like people come across and want to share. And I think that's why somehow the podcast keeps moving, because people are open to sharing. If we didn't have listeners who would share their stories, or guests who would say, yeah, I'm willing to talk about this, there's no podcast. It's Evelyn, me, and Jennifer, like,
So having our own sessions.
chatting away on topics that we are
Yeah.
interested in.
Yeah, I
So
have to
that
say,
way, it's been like really incredible to have this sense of, especially being an Indian and being away from India, to feel like everybody wants to tell their story. That's a very Indian story without being like feeling judged or comparing it to how it might look in the West, etc., etc. This is an Indian story for Indians by Indians, and I think that's what we were gunning for.
Yeah, and I just wanted to agree with you, Sana. Like, for me as well, it's been really like touching and moving to speak to people, and a real privilege that they feel that they can open up and that they want to open up, and they've been so generous with their time and their feelings and everything. And it's it's been like, I've learned a lot. And like, when we were doing the interviews before, we were talking to listeners, you know, it was almost like we were in like therapy sessions together, you know, and it's like, yeah, I've gone through that, or like, I totally know what you mean. Yeah, oh my God, men, like blah, 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 you know, and it's been really, it's been really just a nice thing as well. So.
Yeah, and even though there's a so-called culture gap, I mean, between Germany and India, love is love at the end of the day, and everybody has problems. Do you know what I mean? Like, they might be different because the cultural context in India is different, but there's stuff you can relate to. Like, divorce is probably equally taboo here in the long run in Germany and things like that. So it's just been interesting to, be like, oh yeah, I've been through that too, and I totally get it. And
yeah, I feel like because I've grown up in Germany and then I moved to India when I was 23, 24. I had my fair share of dating experience in Germany, but then also in India. And I think it's true, you know, what Sana is saying, that love is love. And in the end, we all experience the same kind of feelings.
Right. So, Sana, talking about guests, I have a question for you. I mean, what are the kind of guests that we're looking for, especially because, celebrities, not all celebrities are so open to talking about such intimate subjects, right? So how do you handle that?
So there's like, so basically kind of the format goes, we think of a topic that we think would be interesting. And of course, then we have listeners who have during our before we started the podcast, like told us about certain topics that they would be interested in hearing about. And then I do a research on guests, and of course, not all celebrities. So I think what I've also tried to look at is not celebrity in a celebrity sense, because I think those days are over for India where we're like looking at celebrities for all our answers. But just, you know, people who are relatable, like Kaniz. Kaniz is amazing. She was talking about divorce for her stand-up, and she was open to us. Or Sushant Divkar. No, I have to say that name again. Sushant Divkar, who's this activist and LGBTQ plus activist. And I think they're celebrities in their own sense, but moving away from this idea of celebrity. When we think of celebrity, we're like Bollywood. And that is not what we were gunning for as well. Like, it was people who were well known in what they were doing. And yeah, you write to them on Instagram or their email and be like, are you willing to talk to us about this topic? And most of the time it was a yes, unless, schedules didn't match. And I've been really surprised about that. And I think we really try to look at young, influential people who were moving the way topics were being discussed, topics about love and relationships in India. So, Lisa Mangaldas on like sex positivity. And she's not celebrity in a typical sense. If you think about it, she's more of an influencer. So
I
it's
have
been
so many questions for her. I have so many follow-up questions too.
Yeah, I think like it's also for me to like kind of when we were thinking about guests, just to move away from typical celebrity and just look at people who listeners would connect to in terms of stories. Because at the end of the day, we wanted guests who had similar lived experiences. This is not like a typical advice show, because nobody's story is right or wrong. It's all about listening to each other and sharing experiences, and maybe you can get something out of it, and that's wonderful. But
Yeah.
we're not saying this guest has the answer for all your problems. I don't think that's
Even
like,
though I have to say Yasmin Karachiwala, she had a lot of answers for me on motherhood and being a working woman, building this little empire of hers while having
Mhm.
2 children. Now that I'm expecting my first, I felt that was really inspiring to myself.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I think, more like inspirational stories and relatable stories and vulnerable stories is what we were going for. And most of the guests were really open to it. And I think this kind of ties into the fact that everybody's really open to sharing stories right now if it'll help anyone in India. And that's the sense I got from listeners who were willing to come on the show and like really say what they were going through, and
Yeah.
guests who were willing to talk about it.
And we have some very easy topics as well. Like, I think long distance relationships are a big topic at the moment, people being separated, even in different countries because of the pandemic. And it's such a difficult topic, but also such an easy topic. And our guests, Kathy and Benny Dayal, who really mastered having long distance relationship, but also long distance marriage over the last couple of years were really, really interesting to listen to. And I think a lot of our listeners will be, comforted and inspired to listen to their story of having this long distance marriage.
I think it's been sorry, Shashank. I was just going to
No.
connect in with what's Anna and Evelyn were saying there about the guests. I think it's what's also been really wonderful for me, or really nice for us as well, is like how invested the guests have been in the listeners' problems. There's like a real connection there, they're really like really want to like help, or even though they're like, oh, I'm not a counselor or I'm not whatever, they really will be referring back to the person throughout when they're talking, and it's just like that connection is really nice.
Evelyn, did the conversations that you had during the podcast make you reflect on your own relationships, and did they
Absolutely. I was giving way too many anecdotes. I think Jennifer had to cut out a lot of it. But yeah, I think what am I in at the moment? I'm in a very cross-cultural relationship, marriage now. My husband's technically Gujarati, but for a few generations Fijian Indian, and then he is actually from Sydney in Australia. And then I'm this Punjabi German, grown up in Germany, but I feel like I'm so much more Indian than him because I lived in India for 10 years. And I've traveled so much that I've met so many different cultures, and we have this little mixed, cultural thing in our marriage where we don't really know what is our family culture anymore, and we're kind of establishing our own rules now. And then he's of course Hindu, I'm Christian, so we have this interreligious marriage too, which again shows in festivals, in the food that we eat, and so many different ways. And of course, we have met at a time in our life where I was, how old were we? I was probably 32, and he was already 36, I think. And so we have a long history. So, accepting the other person with all the baggage and the problems and the experiences that they come with, it's also something where we've had ups and downs in life. We have to, I think what we didn't realize is that when you get married to the other person's family as well, because we're already so independent at this time in our life that we didn't really realize anymore that we, also have to get to know now the other culture. I speak German, he speaks English. What language will our child grow up with? Is she going to learn German? Are we going to consider moving to Germany, sending her to a German school? There's so many kind of questions that arise. And I felt like every episode was kind of my therapy session too. And because each of these topics kind of relates to my life, past or present relationships, it felt so wonderful just to having these conversations.
Evelyn, before we wrap this up, is there anything you would like to say to the future listeners, people who will be listening to the podcast?
I would love to hear from them. Honestly, it would be so great if our listeners, if anyone out there who's struggling in some sort in love and relationships in life, sends us their questions at lovematters@dw.com. And we would really love to hear from them. So send us your questions. Is it something that you feel like you can't talk to your parents or your friends about? Is there something that you've been struggling with for a long time and you haven't come out with this problem yet? Or maybe it's a life decision you want to make and you don't know how to break it to the people around you. Write us at lovematters@dw.com.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you everyone for joining us. Love Matters is a podcast that both Indian Express and DW have been looking forward to. The first episode is scheduled to release later this month on the 30th. The trailer is already out. You can check that out in the audio section of the Indian Express website and app, also on Spotify and Apple and all other podcast platforms. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Love matters.